In the beginning, once upon a time, when God began creating. We hear these phrases and immediately think story. That something is about to happen, that we're going to hear how something began, its origin, its point. And clearly in the story, there's going to be these clues, these moments where we recognize the future already happening within the story. That what the story is going to end with was already apparent when the story began. That the journey, the direction was happening already. And that these are the things that move it into place, that put it into motion, that become a part of our story, that become a part of our lives. We begin again this season of Lent, perhaps a familiar journey for you or perhaps an unfamiliar one that goes from a season of fasting, giving, and praying to the glorious season of Easter, which is more than a Sunday, 50 days in all. And this is not the season of Lent, but a season in Lent. A time to self-examine where we are in the journey, where we have been in the journey, where we are going in this journey, and where we are called from this journey. It is so easy for us to read the opening chapters of Genesis as news or report. But the stories of Genesis, the beginning stories, those origin stories, are less about what happened and more about explanations of why things are. Why it's less of a news story and more of a soul story. It's more of a case of encountering who we are based on where we are from, based on where it began. This is less about how and more about why. We're given two creation stories at the beginning of Genesis, and this section today is the second version, a different version, not with the familiar and there was evening and there was morning, there was evening, there was morning, where God calls forth and it becomes. And at the end, he rests. This one shows a more involved God at work, and more importantly, the nature of relationships within God and creation and creature, and finally, us. We get right to the placement story, where the human being, often identified by the personal name Adam, although in Hebrew, Adam is not necessarily a personal name. It's actually a name drawn from something else, Adamah, which is the Hebrew word for earth. So, in a sense, the earth creature, the mud guy, if you will, is set into a garden and given tasks to work and till it. But then there's this encounter where God notices something's wrong in creation. This is the first moment of something being called bad. And no, it's not the mention of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, or more importantly, the tree that ought to be called the tree of consequence. Rather, it's the nature of the relationship of the mud guy, the mud being, with creation. That's the problem. What is the problem here is not knowing good and evil. What is the problem here is the loneliness that is apparent in the mud being. God makes the first assertive statement of something wrong when God says, "It is not good for the mud being to be alone. I will make a helper, an easier in the Hebrew, a companion for him." And the first step sounds like what is necessary for a relationship to happen. You have to know the names of something in order to relate to it. And so God gives a task above the tilling and tending of the Garden of Eden as to naming the creatures, creating the creatures and naming the creatures, so that it might be possible that the mud creature, the mud guy, the Adam drawn from the Adamah, will find a relationship with the creature, a fellow creation. And so we go through this process of naming everything. Whatever he called the birds is what the birds will be named. Whatever he called the livestock is what will be named. And it all is given names. And yet, even in this task, a relationship cannot be found. And so we come to the next part of the story, where God grants the human, for the first time, a nap, a sleep, from which he draws out a portion. Now, the word is always translated as rib, although this is the only time that the word is translated as rib. The rest of the time where the word occurs in the Old Testament, it's translated as chamber room or space, usually associated with expanding one's house, one's residence. So a little remodeling, so to speak, is happening. And it's so much more than a spare rib. It seems to be that God is opening the space, drawing from the mud being, another space, and then concluding, sealing up the space. And when the man awakens, there, and to be sure, only there, is suddenly a relationship that's possible. And despite all the naming that has gone on in this story, this is the only one that we have a particular name actually said. Esau, which means woman in Hebrew. This shall be called woman, drawn out of the mud creature. Up until that point, the mud creature is ambiguous in gender, sexuality, but now there is indeed the female along with the male. As we've experienced the COVID pandemic these past 4 weeks that turned into 2 years, what has been alarming has been the reinforced truth in God's statement that loneliness is a real threat to life and livelihood. That it is truly not good when we isolate ourselves, when we barricade ourselves, when we separate ourselves, when there is no companionship with us. Most of the human tragedy that prevails in news and in story is that of which a loner has done a terrible act of violence. A lonely person. One who was isolated from others. Whether by design or by circumstance that drew them away from one another. We've experienced that separation here as we have returned, but not all have returned. Some have remained separate from us. Some likely are separate from us for good. Others anticipate a return once certain conditions are met. Now, whether after those conditions are met they still return is really up to them. But we are no good. It's reminded to us again and again when we are not in partnership with one another. Our stories of where we came from inform us where we are. And I'm sure that each one of us could share our origin stories, and likely our origin stories would begin with, well, we came from our parents. And that our lives are in direct relationship with their lives, and our values were their values, and we were shaped and molded by those who came before. The same would be true with our story here at Prairie Avenue. We have a birth date we celebrate every year, September 26th, recognizing that that day, that Friday morning, was when the construction of the first building on this place began. A building completed in a day by crews from First Christian and Central Christian churches. Our Prairie Avenue history didn't start from nothing. It came from somewhere and is going to someplace. Where is our story now? Because as we push back our beginning and our origin stories, we recognize that our beginning actually begins earlier and begins earlier until, frankly, Prairie Avenue's story begins all the way at the moment where God calls forth creation into being. Relationships don't happen in a vacuum. Relationships are drawn one from another. And what we've experienced in these last couple years is that what we have named and what we have called forth may no longer be named or called forth anymore. May not be what the world and what others is looking for in a relationship with God and one another. That the story of our success, our story of our achievement, our rise, is not the end of the story either. And as we have witnessed and felt the pain of decline and loss, sorrow and suffering, it would be easy for us to say that God is done with this, that the end is closed, that the story will conclude, that the final is being written. As we look about and see fewer and fewer and fewer around us. Our story today that celebrates the powerful relationship between two companions, finding that one is an extension of one's flesh, that one is connected much more than by name, but by presence. It's all too easy to chalk this up to only answering the nature of marriage. And unfortunately, the legacy of interpretation of this story implies that there's a certain hierarchy, that there is a certain separation, that there are walls and barriers that are justified by such a story. But I think the deeper truth here is loneliness is something that all of us need companionship for. That God's truth is our truth, that our lives are not good when we isolate, when we separate, when we break off from the story and think that we are all alone. Life seems to have a pattern here. We might call this story the splitting of the atom. For what was potential had to be drawn from what already existed. And we see that pattern again and again in the universe we reside in, that life comes from life, that things come to be from things that were, and that even this place came to be from places that were, who were places that came to be from places that were, and so an unbroken chain leading back to that lamp-lit room in Jerusalem and a Last Supper. Our story was there, and our story is still here, and our story will go forth as long as life endures. The question we must ask ourselves now is, what is our life for? What will we give a portion of ourselves in order to find and to have the companionship we need as part of our human nature? Are we willing to be a place of refuge, a place that provides space for those seeking companionship with God and reconciliation with neighbor? Will we allow God, in a sense, to put us asleep for a moment, that he can recreate a new thing, that he can draw out new life from a body aching for others to be a part of? As we begin this journey together, as we live in the tension of a movement of restoration and reclaiming, will we allow God to bring new life into our being? That sounds like the opening of a great story. Will you let it begin in you?